Thank you. I think it's a great privilege to be here today. As you've just heard from Richard, I'm not only part of one elite group, but two. And actually, I'm also part of three, because like today I found out that I'm an AIDS elder. So as well as living with HIV for 21 years, I'm also a published author. And while Ubuntu is not about HIV, I do reveal this twist at the end of my extraordinary motorcycle journey across Africa, which I did against all odds 23 years ago. And I'm not going to bang on about my book, but it's all part of my talk here today. So I'm sure your minds are all abuzz with many questions. And the first one that everyone thinks, they might not ask, but they think is, how did I get it? Why did I do such a journey? What does Ubuntu mean? And why did it take me so long to write my book? And I'll get to that in a moment. Ubuntu is a Bantu word from South Africa, which means I am because we are. It is the universal bond that connects us all as one. And this is what was shown to me by the African people. The idea to travel Africa was one of those light bulb moments that I can only describe as a call to explore, to seek adventure, and also to seek meaning. It is a calling that is innately human. But I didn't pack condoms for my trip because I had no intention of having sex. I ignored that sex is also innately human. I was a smart young woman. Before my travels, I was employed as a radiation safety technician in the Northern Territory at a uranium mine. And I knew Africa was the epicentre of the HIV pandemic in the early 1990s while I was planning my journey. Yet still, I had that one unguarded moment. And I'm sure I am not the only person to travel overseas who has had unprotected sex, and certainly will not be the last. I wonder just how many of those newly diagnosed in Australia also had an unguarded moment while on a trip of a lifetime. And what about the growing number of people who are diagnosed when HIV has already destroyed much of their immune system? And what about those whose diagnosis comes too late? And even with the advanced HIV treatments we have today, they still die from AIDS. And what about all those yet to be diagnosed? We live in a global world, and HIV is a global disease. People, especially young people, travel, and people, especially young people, have sex. And they don't all use condoms, as 86,000 young people who were diagnosed with chlamydia in Australia last year show. Is it any wonder HIV is still here? And is it any wonder it's on the move? I too could have been one of the growing number diagnosed late with HIV, but I was one of the lucky ones in that I had a HIV test while I was still healthy and living and working in London. I was preparing for the second leg of my world motorcycle journey, and the test was a requirement of a 3-month visa for Russia. I was diagnosed in September 1995, when death from AIDS was inevitable, and just 10 months before the first of the new generation of HIV treatments became available. I was told I had 5 years, but there was no mention of the hope that was on the horizon. So what does one do when faced with their mortality and given no hope? They pack their motorcycle, of course, and go on one last adventure, one last search for meaning, which also became a search for salvation. But as I travelled east into Central Asia and down through China, I became sicker and weaker. When I reached Vietnam nearly a year later, I knew I needed urgent medical treatment. I took the first flight to Australia to arrive unexpectedly on my parents' doorstep. I had not told them I had HIV. Instead, I explained my ill health, saying I'd picked up a particularly bad stomach bug in China. I lived with a dark secret because I was so full of fear about rejection and shame. My silence nearly killed me because I did not reach out for help until my darkest hour. Help that told me about the recent discovery of effective HIV medications that would save me from death. Under the pretence I was moving to Cairns to begin the next chapter of my young life, I'd secretly phoned the Queensland AIDS Council, a support group for people living with HIV. And a day later I was in hospital with the nurses insisting I tell my parents and the doctors asking if I wanted to see the chaplain. "I'll get over this," I replied. So effective were these new HIV treatments that 10 days later, on Christmas Eve, I was out of hospital and home with my parents, who were none the wiser that I'd had a brief glimpse of what waits for us on the other side. With my health restored, 2 months later I went to university and studied journalism, and after graduating in 2000 worked for News Limited. Outwardly, I was in good health and was on the path to a successful career, but I still carried a dark secret, the stigma of HIV. It stopped me from having close relationships, so I arranged my own marriage with an HIV-positive man I met online. We moved to Melbourne, where I worked for an international NGO. With the advances in HIV medications, my husband and I were reassured by the staff at the Alfred Hospital's HIV clinic, some of whom are in the audience today, that it was safe to start a family, and we had 3 boys free of HIV. Unfortunately, the marriage did not last. But while I was a happy, healthy single mother who still rides motorcycles, stigma hung like a dark cloud over my life. My fear of anyone finding out was now for my children. I wanted them to have a normal childhood, to be invited to birthday parties and playdates, and not to be rejected because of me. So insidious is HIV stigma that it also affects by association. When I was diagnosed with HIV in 1995, I faced certain death. I wrote my book Ubuntu as I did not want that extraordinary journey to die with me. But when I didn't die, I shelved the manuscript because part of that story is also HIV. In 2016, I told my story and Black Ink published it. I'm proud of my book, and many people are proud of me for saying enough is enough to stigma. But that does not mean that I have been embraced by all. I received a call from a school mum advising my children were no longer welcome at her house, but it wasn't because of that, she said. A statewide corporation keen for me to do an author talk cancelled after I'd given them a copy of my book, as did a national motorcycle group. So nothing has really changed with those diagnosed with HIV in 2016. They join many of the 37 million people living with HIV in the world today who continue to live in fear of shame, rejection and isolation from family, friends and community. This is not Ubuntu. This is not the universal bond that connects us all. 2016 is the year I gave my voice completely to raise awareness about HIV and to educate others to take responsibility for their sexual health. As a speaker with the Positive Speakers Bureau, I now speak to all schools and not just those outside a 20-kilometre exclusion zone of Healesville where I live. I've spoken proudly about living with HIV to the media, even to my local paper. 2016 is the year I stood up to stigma, stood up to the shame society places on us. I stood up to the silence because so many young people, the middle-aged and older Australians too have forgotten about HIV. This is why HIV is still here, and this is why it's on the move. Thank you.